in a sense, broad brush sense of my work. I want to do a little bit of a picture. I'll put these 3 infographics up. Let me move this. So in an African context, and for some of you, this will be totally familiar, but big picture story, we have cities growing at the highest rate in the world. So the numbers are not significant compared to this context at all, but really massive growth rates of cities, of primary cities, but also of secondary cities. And I think the other dynamic that's really essential in a sub-Saharan African context is that this of course is a very crass statistic, but 62% of housing is somehow classified as slum housing, as informal. And of course that means any myriad of things in practice. And this again is broad brush picture, but in that context, we have a dominance of informal economic systems. And again, all of our work, sits in critically examining and engaging with what that informality means. And in an African context, we've got economies which are highly commodity dependent, still driven by primary exports and very vulnerable to shifts in the global economy. So we see swings and down, ups and downs, but very many downs. Layering in to that, we have a demographic where we have a majority youthful population, and that increasing rapidly. What I'm telling is a story of what sounds like utter dysfunction, and that's not really the spirit of the point here. But we have, in this context, governments with very small tax bases, with massive institutional challenges, and we don't actually have a whole lot of work precisely on institutions in this context. And I think another layer that is so essential in an African city context is the particularity of the form of cities, which still has a bifurcated colonial legacy that is very present in its planning, but also in the form of the city. So this long history of, and very recent history, this late form of colonialism that divided cities. And we can see that in all sorts of variations, again, across the continent. And in South Africa, that is an imprint of segregation, of a colonial history of segregation and planning, and then an apartheid history that lands on that, and of course shapes everyday life in all sorts of ways. So I think in all of this big picture story, which in a way sounds deeply familiar and totally problematic, but we have a really intensive need for fine-grained work and research on African city life, on all the many creative, challenging, survivalist, innovative ways ordinary people have to work, to plan, to build homes, to build livelihoods, to claim and bypass the state, to live in all sorts of forms, to aim to live fully, at least. And I think it's in that spirit, in this regional conversation, that there's a real imperative to not actually land in those massive, big, broad brush picture of informality, and to open up those questions and to really attempt to do research that sits, that takes this urban African context in its diversity, in its complexity, seriously, not as a deficit model, not as retarded development, not as simply governance failure, although of course those are like urgent crises that have to be accounted for. So I think that this is a quote from Edgar Peterson writing exactly about this, that we know that urban dwellers are nothing if not resilient, that people are able to find room to hustle, invest, hedge, negotiate, contract, support, extract, a whole series of very important verbs. But really our scholarship is, that's the imperative for scholarship. And I think in a Southern African context, and in a South African context, we have a challenge of scholarship, but in a South African context, we have been challenged to critically think about the work of scholarship and the work of research and the position of the university And of course, I'm sure that is a very present conversation here as well. But in the context of roads must fall and fees must fall and student mobilizations and broader societal mobilizations, we really have an active debate and challenge to think about what is the project of research, and what is the project of teaching and learning, and how do we both take these realities seriously but work to situate them. And that I'm still affiliated to African Center for Cities, and that's the context that feels very much at home for me. And that's the mission of the center. And I think for African Center for Cities, but for this African urban conversation, it's a big field, and it's a big debate. But I think there's three things that I want to really pull out of it. It's very easy to be stuck in both those debates about dysfunction, but also to be stuck in a debate that sounds exceptional. And that's a real challenge in a South African conversation, but also in a broader field of African studies. So I really appreciate this work by Laurent Fouchard, a French researcher, who says analyzing Africa's cities within the larger frame of the global South serves a dual purpose. It avoids their construction as exceptional, which is really this long tradition, both theoretically, philosophically, empirically, and it reasserts them in a broader academic debate that is situated in the continent's history and in all those various national histories, but also is open to a broader story. And that's so, sorry, this is a little bit cut off, but it's really imperative to think the specificities, to think the practices, and at the same time to not be removed from the rest of the world. So for me, this is a real inspiration. It's what Susan Parnell, a colleague who some of you might know her work, she makes an argument that making African urban research legible, making it influential internationally, but I think really the point here is legibility, that's a key part of this project. And that it's a project both of framing African urbanism on its own time, in its own terms, but also situating in these broader debates. And Southern urbanism really helps us do that. So I think that's a big project. In that is an invitation to also not just think about the politics of our research and the scope of our research, but also to think about methods and the practice of research. And I've get some inspiration from a piece by Jenny Robinson and Ananya Roy, where they're really inviting us to think about the culture and the practice of research, and the imperative for what they suggest is a heterodox field of inquiry. How can we really seriously have many entry points? How can we both engage in deep, rigorous local knowledge, really working at that micro scale, but still have, not get sucked into that and have an engagement with political economy, with broader conversations? How can we work and build a comparative reading of cities? So that might be in a South African context, not just looking at metros, especially in a South African context, having a broader continental conversation. And then really in this frame of Southern urbanism, conversations with India, Brazil, with, whatever way we can do that, but still having this deep, rigorous local knowledge. So how can we produce alternative modes of inquiry, new geographies of theory? And that's really both for me a practical question, but also a political question. It's also about how do we think about the theoretical conversation and this work that helps us methodologically rebuild ideas. So that's that's maybe way too broad brush and epistemological, but in a way that's an entry point into what has in part inspired the work that I'm going to share now, which is my own project of thinking about how do I engage rigorously in a very intimate way, long-term way in a city in Cape Town. And how do I at the same time think about that as a project of urban theorizing and a project of thinking about the ways in which we know the city. Okay, so on that note, I'm going to move onto this. I have to say, so the fact I can actually hold this up is a miracle. It's actually really quite, for me, quite an emotional thing. It's the first time I'm presenting this work with a book in hand. And it's been a very long labor of love and actually a whole lot of other emotions. My daughter is very big and she calls this book sometimes her sibling. And when she's in a sarcastic mode, she understands it's why she doesn't actually have a full-bodied living sibling. And what I really would like to start with is that this book and this project is actually a product of many amazing people, many hands, many minds, an awful lot of care, an awful lot of conversation. And these pictures are of the, I'll tell you a little bit about high stakes, high hopes and urban theorizing in partnership. But this is really the product of a partnership which is with a neighborhood organization in Cape Town. In particular, the woman where you can see she's in a lot of the pictures here, her name is Gertie Square. Very sadly, she died about 1.5 years ago, or 2 years ago now. And she's really someone who's shaped my thinking, led me, her daughters as well. You know, it's really been formative. We have a joke in her family that she's Professor Square. And so that she's really part of this conversation. But this conversation is also produced with many urbanists and friends in African Center for Cities in South Africa. Antonario, my colleague and dear friend, is here from Brazil. It's the product of lots of experimenting with teaching, really being pushed by students and colleagues in the African Center for Cities, where we've got a program of an MPhil in Southern Urbanism. So Anna Shalmaxki and Laura Nkula. And at the same time, it's the product of lots of people's thinking. Richard Naga, who some of whom you might know, definitely you know Goffin Ban, all sorts of interlocutors who insisted, you know, rightly that, you know, my research and its agendas needed to shift. So I know this is a little bit of a long-winded way, but I really wanted to share this as a starting point. The context for the work is, and I'll explain that in a second. And most of my scholarly publishing has been on social movement organizing, on community organizing, on thinking about how, really taking seriously how groups claim rights, how neighborhood work contests hierarchies in this African city, how social movement builds around housing mobilization, anti-eviction struggles, land occupation, a politics of informality. And this was my lens on the city. And I wanted to do a little bit of a story of explaining why I turned, like many people, to collaborative work and to participatory work. And so I'm going to start and just tell this story through questions that really provoked me to shift this mode of work. And the first one is actually a very literal question, which happened a long time ago. I was working on my PhD, and I'm sure, like here, I needed to get permission to work in a settlement. And I was presenting my work. It was much harder than presenting it to any academic audience or to my committee and to my professor who was supervising me. And this committee in this informal settlement, we were meeting on a winter's night across the street in a school classroom. And the committee leader said to me, will I run away like every researcher that he had met before? And will I run away actually like every researcher he had met from my university? You know, it was very, very precise and personal. So my university is formerly segregated white up on the mountain slope, far 20 kilometers from this place. And really that question stayed with me. He was asking me very, very directly, was I going to run away? But his provocation wasn't, would I just return? It wasn't, would I just bring my research? I came back, I taught in the night school, but that wasn't actually, that was a little bit of the provocation, but the provocation was really, how were my questions relevant to the settlement's struggle, their very precise struggle to get secure land, to claim housing from the state. But underlying that question was also something deeper and as important, and a longer term thing that I've really been sitting with, which was, how would I write and for whom would I write? And I found that just really incredibly challenging and so obviously essential, in this demand that my research, that I was explicit about my relationship of my research to the settlement, that I locate my work in the settlement's struggle for secure land. How could I respond to that? And conventional academic work doesn't respond adequately to that. I just went to a thing in this university I'm now teaching at Cornell, and they were like, the social responsiveness of work is a social good in itself. Like, well, actually, is it? And that's what his question was asking me. So this shaped my work, and it shaped how I've been thinking about, how can I actually respond to that? How can I think about my questions? So this is what this story of this book is about. This is, of course, a question which we sit with in lots of contexts. In a South African context, it's a central question to why are we doing the research that we're doing. And so I'm building on a long body of work, an inspiration of how do we think about the theoretical significance of activism in a place where activism has shaped our imagination of society, the project of reworking the state, in a place where that's been so important. And I really appreciate Edgar Peters's quote here that South African scholarship demands what he calls contamination. It demands immersion into profoundly fraught and contested spaces of power and control. I wouldn't use the word contamination myself. I think we're implicated in it, we're associated in it. Can we work on that? I've really been building off of, in an Indian context, Richa Naga's work, a feminist geographer. And I'm just going to offer a little sliver. If you know her work, there's obviously a whole body of decades of thinking and writing, but her provocation that we can reorient university, and here she writes about it as Northern, but really that means universities anywhere. Can we reorient university theoretical agendas to the struggles of those with whom we engage? And yes, we can. And that's what that question was really pushing me to do. So for me, it's a personal question, a political question, a pragmatic question, but it's deeply a scholarly question. So could I find a mode of research where I didn't run away? At the same time, I was a new lecturer when I started this, and I'm clearly not a new lecturer now. I shouldn't tell these elements of the story. But I was really interested in how do I teach in a way that immerses my students in the city? And that should not be an issue, right? Teaching in a southern city, but actually I had to break with all sorts of modes of how can I think about this teaching outside of the classroom? And it was also a very direct response to my own education, where I really felt I got taught methods. I didn't get taught methods. We didn't even look out of the window. So how could I think about teaching both urban studies, but also methods, so that this was an issue that we could engage with? At the same time, the civic organization, this community organization that I worked with, Goethe Square was the leader, they had a huge need for research. And so this is a community that was segregated in a South African context, Black, technically segregated colored. It was a place built in the 1980s, a site where people were moved from informal settlements and sent to this public housing. It was a place of all sorts of activism. And I met the leaders of this organization in a citywide anti-eviction campaign. And we experimented first with the ways in which that in working with the campaign and having an exchange with them in responding to their question that the research engaged with their struggle. We experimented first with how could myself and other university colleagues support the questions that activists were doing, on the premise that, of course, activists do research all the time, but could we help hone the questions and hone the arguments? And so we started this process, and there's a literal moment where I came to visit. I'd helped them with the survey, these women running this community organization, and I walked into the living room of my friend, and this group of women were just depressed. And I was like, what's wrong? And they said, how are we ever going to complete this survey? A, it's really boring. B, we've done 50 households. We have another 1,500 to go. And so that was a moment where I said, actually, I have a class full of students. Can we start this collaboration? So I'm telling these little details of this because this was a collaborative process that started very slowly and built around housing struggles in particular. And really built around this particular community organization. It had very strong leadership, 30 years of working in the neighborhood. And it's that relationship and that partnership with the civic, with this community organization that gives this book and this work its problem space. So how could we work together? How could we build a partnership? What were the questions and issues that mattered? How that got developed in conversation? What were the hopes and worries, both in the university and in the neighborhood? And how was this a means to develop projects? And basically, let me just check where I'm going. Oh yeah. Basically, how could I had this opportunity of bringing in students. We did it for a year. We did it for another year. It was positive. It was interesting. And how could we then think of this as a mode of teaching where we're teaching in the classroom, but also in settlements, also on the street, in the library. And we developed a quite simple model, which we then rolled out for a process of a period of 10 years. Basically, we had an annual project. It became part of the syllabus. The research questions were decided together. They started to be all initially around housing, and I'll explain that in a little bit. They moved on to informal settlements. So this is a map that we produced of a settlement that was self-built, contested by the state. They won the court case. The civic in this case really wanted to show how this was a secure form of living. So we retrospectively worked on this. The projects were by design projects that students and neighborhood partners could do together. So they were things that social science skills, the things I had to teach in urban studies, could allow us to do. And we agreed in principle that there would be multiple research outputs, things that resonated in the university, things that resonated in the neighborhood, in the city. None of this is rocket science, but these were really important principles. So over a period of this 10 years, the first 5 years, we're really working on questions of housing, backyard housing, informal settlement, land occupations, this old one, a new one that developed afterwards. We worked on community-driven cultural politics, which in the South African context is a carnival and a minstrels project. We worked on home-based businesses in a context where, like many neighborhoods like this, there's very little formal work. So we researched the ways in which families made ends meet. In this context, questions of xenophobia and violence around the notion of who was a local and who was not really shaped the project. We worked on civic projects. What was the work of activism, which was really diffuse and situated in this huge array of issues? And really the important thing in this partnership is over time, to keep it relevant, it shape-shifted with the politics, both of the neighborhood and of the city, in the shifting nature of the civic and its organization itself, and also with me and my students as we developed the ways to do this. Most importantly, I think, obviously, this is not a romance. This was a process filled with sometimes outright conflict, compromises, all sorts of complicities. I found Geraldine Pratt's work really useful. She has a language of collaboration as always productively compromised, as this space of what Tuck and Yang described, drawing on a US context in their case, of the incommensurability of working between university and community and neighborhood in a context of segregated, in a US and a South African context of settler colonialism. I found really useful work thinking both about refusals in that context, what shapes this productively compromised work, but also at the same time invitations when this is a long-term partnership. And we are really working and inhabiting that space, inhabiting and working between these contradictions. In politics, sometimes we're very clear, and other times, more often than not, we're opaque, sometimes named, sometimes not. Teaching was really essential to this. And as I said already, like I really needed a way to teach in this very unequal city context. That was really important to me. But teaching was also foundational to what sustained the partnership. So this is a archive of like, pictures across the years of these teams of students working with neighborhood partners. So it was really foundational because it really shifted and centered all sorts of expertise. So partners' expertise. And we designed that just practically. The partnership research project, as I said, was at the heart of the curriculum. Half the course aimed to be in the neighborhood, half the course was in the university classroom. And that was this back and forth, a weekly back and forth with reading literature. So this is not a disavowal of academic work, right? It's an embracing of academic work, but reading literature and combining it with journal writing and a process of writing and engaging and practicing methods and having a lot of conversations weekly with the partners, with students, and mediating and doing that. We developed all sorts of ways of assessing. So it's so obvious, but it took me ages to get to actually do it, to bring partners, and they assessed with me. And so to be having the neighborhood come into the university, so to speak, actually a really crucial thing where you can see the university from the neighborhood, but hardly anybody ever goes there. And it's really, really a segregated space. So teaching repositioned expertise, and in many senses, it was the compass that held the partnership. I think what's really key here, and in the book I write about it in a narrative way, but I won't go into that here. But I was one of many teachers, instead of being the professor in charge of everything, which anyway, in reality, the professor isn't in charge of everything, but partners were teachers. In all sorts of neighborhood protocol, in language, in vocabulary, in understanding questions, in seeing and making visible all sorts of layers of local knowledge. In this, students and partners and I were also at the same time learning and figuring out how to do this. And this shifted university practice. So in naming this book, The High Hopes, I'll come back to this, isn't actually high hopes for this neighborhood, which is in a very difficult and often deteriorating conditions, but really hopes for thinking about this practice. So what was normally the purview of the professor, of me in this case, of the university, the curriculum, its standards, my sense of rigorous research, this was infused and shaped by neighborhood partner expertise, debate, logic, care, commitments. And that process of accounting was really, really crucial. These are just a few pictures to give you a feel, both of the methods of interviewing, of this week by week process. Any of you've run, I didn't ever actually expect to put this into a publication. So actually it was really a pleasure to go back and to gather together all those layers of notes and documents and draft maps and the maps that didn't work in the neighborhood and did work, and to really actually in this work write about this. In this work, we had a commitment to producing multiple publications, as I've said already. And this again is also sort of obvious, but publics is at the heart of that word of publications. But really embracing that and thinking about who are the publics in this partnership. So over the course of a decade, we have an archive of project publications, and they range from maps. So this is a map of this new settlement, 1 year at his first birthday, actually, and pieced together with photos, with a different sort of form of mapping. So we have maps, we have directories, we have pamphlets, we have so-called popular books, we have journal articles, this book. And I think the really key thing is in this writing and reflecting on this afterwards is thinking about the topography of publics, to whom we encountered, to whom we engaged. And my thinking about that in relation to that question of can I stay rather than run away? What this really did for me really usefully in thinking is not getting stuck in this dichotomy of popular material of somehow things that are for the neighborhood and things that are for the university, but in actually writing and thinking about how do these documents and these different publications get produced? How do they get used? There's a much finer grained web of what's durable, what's repeatable, what's reliable, what gets pulled out time and time again, what's actually more fragile. So that is has been a really productive element and is a layer of this book. And I think at the same time, really questioning and thinking more carefully about what this assumption that something was local. So just to give you a feel, that these are some of the successful and not successful little books that we produced. But I'd like to just give a little feel of this. This was a project and a product, a yellow pages that came out of the mapping of businesses and the work on employment and home-based businesses. And the spirit of this was that there was an impetus in the neighborhood. The civic wanted to push a buy local campaign. Don't go to the shopping center 5 kilometers away, rather invest in the neighborhood. And there was, of course, a myriad of all sorts of visible and not so visible, and some that didn't want to be visible, businesses. And so we produced a yellow pages, intentionally a local product. But this got caught up, and I write about these layers in the book, got caught up in a moment of very intense xenophobic violence. And we produced this research. There was this very present, sometimes absolutely, sometimes obtuse, but tension around interviewing so-called foreigners and hearing these stories about neighborhood businesses closing and why, and the logic of that. And be in between finishing the research and publishing this yellow pages, the foreign-owned businesses, Somali-owned businesses, particularly in this neighborhood, were petrol bombed and pushed out. So a moment of terrible violence, and a violence which is completely implicated in producing a yellow pages to buy local, to support local. So in writing and reflecting on these publics, it's a chance to actually have this conversation with the civic, and the civic had very, very contradictory and totally legitimate positions in this mix. So on the one hand, they enabled people to come in. They were the source of where could you locate. On the other hand, they were sometimes proud of being xenophobic, of supporting businesses, so-called local businesses. On the other hand, they were caught up in this politics. So I think in the book, I go into, I really write carefully about that process, and I have lots of pages here, but I'm not going to read them. But it's really the spirit of thinking, of really writing carefully about, in that always productively compromised collaboration, we are both inhabiting it. Sometimes we are confronted with difference, the complicities, the compromises, the violence of those differences, and at other times we're reworking them. And for instance, in our methodology, of this assessing and accounting in the neighborhood, we'd have a 3/4 of the way through the project, we'd have a research party in the neighborhood where we invited everybody that we interviewed to come and to read the work in progress, to check stories, to look at photographs, to have a conversation about this emerging analysis. And in the context of this project, this was extremely difficult to have a gathering of local people. And so we had in writing about this, where I'm writing about this politics and about, in this particular, in this party, about a moment when this trader family, Somali family, came in, and where are the spaces for conversation, and where are the spaces in which this becomes very, very, very difficult. So I'm not doing a very good job of explaining it in this long-winded way. I probably should have just read an extract. But I think the main thing, and these are pictures of different parties, of different research parties, where we're having a conversation about this work in progress. And I think the really critical thing in thinking about these publications and these research outputs is they definitely disrupt a narrow notion of what counts as research in the academy. In trying to do urban studies in this thicker way, the partnership really makes problematic, but doesn't throw out what scholarly publications do. but it really opens up a chance to think about how can we, what capacity do we have to respond, to engage, to account, to find relevance, and to find practices that are really relevant. So I want to move on to the next question. And this was really the challenge, and maybe why this took me so long, besides the fact that I'm slow, is I had to find a way of writing about this partnership. And I started off writing in a conventional ethnography, and it really didn't work. I luckily had some very dear friends who I've acknowledged in the beginning who were like, no, this is not working. You're actually paralyzed between the academy and activism. And so I had to change my form. And in a way, it's obvious now, but the partnership is really the analytical focus of this book, this urban theorizing in partnership, the partnership practices. And basically, in short, in the book, I turned to narratives, to stories of the actual practice of this work to make visible the partnership, to make visible its forms, its strategies, and turning to stories, right, which is a very different form of theorizing. It's not just an aesthetic choice, but it's actually showing the nuance, the texture of the work, the layering, and it's the narratives both show how we sustain the project, its visceral elements, its felt elements, it being situated in the timing and the language of the neighborhood, its activism, but also in the timing and the language of the university, in the curriculum, in the scholarly work, and really using stories to move back and forth. Stories are full of sometimes surprise, sometimes humor, openings, closings, possibilities, limits. They're about teaching and about research. The stories are about me and the partners and my students. And sometimes the we here is the partnership working as a unit. Sometimes it's actually about the we is me and my partners making decisions. Sometimes the we is actually students and me working and coming into the neighborhood. There's a really complex topography. Sometimes equally, I put myself into the middle of this book, and there's a shifting sense of me in that. So it's my curiosities, interactions, my blunders, my mistakes, failures of projects. And I think really in writing in this way, I'm building on a bunch of work which is encouraging us to think creatively about writing. But I think in this partnership work, it's showing these, and I'm going to say it in such a simple way, but what are the verbs? What is the actual practice at the heart of the partnership? And it's mixing and matching questions rooted in the neighborhood and the community. It was a process of unraveling and fusing back together commitments and concepts. And we really see that in the publications. It was a mixture, and again, it's like quite straightforward, but really fundamental, of juxtaposing and entwining together language, experience, forms of accounting and reviewing. I think in the accounting and reviewing and this notion of consent and conversation, that we can really see that juxtaposition, but that entwining. So I think what I'm aiming for in this book is that the narratives invite the reader into the partnership, into its thick context, into its intricacies, into its costs, into its complicities, into the hope that it offers, the feelings in it, the ethos, what allowed us to sustain the work. It was fun, it was challenging, but like making that visible and making that textured. And in doing that, it's for me repositioning the work of teaching and research, making it tangible, making it trackable. Okay, I'm gonna almost be there. It's sharing the risks and the stakes, and the stake, you know, what was it at stake? And also the way we work through them. So really exploring those compromises, those complicities. And in doing that, it really disrupts this neat and categorical notion of the neighborhood and the university. It reveals questions. And at the same time, it doesn't dismiss that. It doesn't romance or write that over. It's a way in which method became substance, right? Pedagogy became substance. And in here is a mode of theorizing of everyday words that are produced in the partnership. My everyday words are in English. They reflect all the limits of my linguistic skills. And there are other vocabularies in the project, in Afrikaans, in Kaps, But the words I want to draw out here are simple and they're powerful and they're really key for me as a form of theorizing. So from dignity found in and fought for through, in homes, in organizing, in the civic work, in the partnership work, in this turn to research, in an endless struggle to make ends meet. Phrases like not once, not twice, but thrice, this consistent work of notions of community, of experiences of violence. So these are not surprising words, they're ordinary, but in this writing, we can see the step-by-step pedagogy of interviewing and engaging which produced them. So for me, that is really a way of thinking about the partnership, thinking about this form of theorizing, and the practice and the pedagogy of the partnership, which tries to challenge this very binary notion of who researches whom, who's the subject of research, who's visible in the writing, who's has the expertise, who's known, who's the knower. And it's really in its spirit and in its outcome is aiming to argue that theorizing in partnership offers us in urban studies a way of embracing partner and community and neighborhood expertise and recalibrating it as sites of valid knowledge production. And of course we know that and we can say that, but it's really thinking about the verbs and the doing and the practicing and the bit by bit incrementality of that. So in conclusion, I really hope, along with others, that this High Stakes, High Hopes is a contribution to an alternative way of doing urban theorizing, an alternative way of really embracing urban knowledge, and one of many experiments for thinking about more varied forms of theorizing and more varied forms of writing in the academy, more varied forms of research and teaching. And I'm imagining this book, and I hope it's brand new, so let's see, but as really an invitation not to do what I've done, right? It made sense in the context of this project, but to imagine any range of other partnerships in cities and contexts all over the place. And to think about that, going back to this inspiration for African urbanism, for thinking Southern urbanism as a source of energy, a source of inspiration, a source of innovation, that really going back to these big stories of dysfunction, this big need for engaging urban everyday life, that can bring that into the academy. And I'm now working in this really cloistered ivory tower in a tiny little town in upstate New York, which is down the road from my mom. That part's good, but it's very interesting moving into an academy which is extremely elite and very cloistered, and this is totally this is about all the ways in which, for me, in Southern cities, in urban studies, I think actually more generally, we are always engaging, we're always reliant on conversations, whether it's with policymakers, community organizers, planners of any variety of sorts, and that it's actually about embracing and I'm just going to read this last line. It's an invitation to form partnerships. We have them anyway, but to take them seriously and invest in them and to commit to them, to nurture them, to account to them. And for me, going back to that first question, would I run away? To return to them. So that's the inspiration. Thank you. Oh, and it's open access. That's the benefit of the cloistered ivory tower that I'm in.
Yeah, you use that.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Sophie. I'm sure everyone has a lot of questions. Folks on Zoom, if you could just put your questions into either the Q&A or chat box, whatever's open to you, we'll take them soon. But before we get there, I just wanted to respond quickly and sort of just to ask Sophie, maybe kickstart the question answer session. It's your book starts with this question of staying and running away, but if you do choose to stay, there are about 1 million things that you can choose to do or not do, and I think there is what the curiosity really is. Like if you do make the choice to stay, what does that really entail, and what does that really mean for you and for the community, and sort of how equal or unequal that relationship is over time. So just wanted to ask you, you talked about answering questions or speaking to questions rooted in the community. To what extent is that, and I understand that there's a constant interaction with the community, which raises a certain set of questions, but is there a tension between those questions raised and what academia or what your academic training would 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 sort of urge you to ask? Do those come together? Do they sometimes actually act in tension with each other, but you're still able to address them in some way? So that's one part of the question. And in the same sort of the choice that you've made to do this through teaching. So it's, one thing is to have a very engaged research project. Many of us here in this room have also done that, where you've engaged with the same community for many years as a researcher, but teaching is a whole different form, and there are different students who are coming in and leaving. And you're going into it with this particular set of ethics and this ethos. So the curiosity really was that in staying, when you're bringing in so many different actors into it, do they also really imbibe the ethos? And if they don't, or if it's very differentiated, if their attitudes are quite different because they are individuals, how do you really manage that process? And I guess my final question is that, your example about the violence and about the xenophobia was quite stark. And, a lot of our problems, or what we worry about when we do this kind of engaged research, is this what point is it going to backfire on us? Because at some level, we're always outsiders, however much we may be working in partnership. And on the other hand, we're also always responsible for the harm that our interventions may cause. So that sort of ethical side. So I know it's a bunch of 3 different questions, but it's also sort of all linked to this larger question of staying is okay, but what does that really mean? And what do we do with the discomforts that it raises?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, those are really, in a sense, yeah, those are the central questions. And I'll start in the middle. I mean, for me, in the spirit of writing this, is to turn all of those actually into empirical questions, and really to write the complexity of that. So, I'll start in the beginning. So one of the things why this made sense initially to me is that the activism that I was engaging with, these different movements, the way I was writing about it and the way in which the literature framed it was around a right to the city, around claims on the state, around thinking about the presence and the absence of the state, around the language in that space, the language of the scholarship, and then in my own work, and in that more conventional research work, it was really exploring all these savvy ways in which activists both challenge and participate, and just adding a much more nuanced sense of texture. So that initial place was a very comfortable space to start and to work. In other moments, there's that once we dug into it, there were all sorts of things that I wasn't supposed to engage. So for instance, and these are the sorts of moments that I share in the book. The vice principal of the local high school, I met him, and again, this is around violence. Like the day before, there was a whole spate of very violent crime, and somebody had been murdered, and he said, there was a body outside the school today. Why do you think you've never, with your partners, ever done research on crime and crime prevention? Why do you think this civic organization that is brilliant at housing and housing activism does nothing around this work? Because they can't, because there's actually a political economy of both a political economy of what might be in the media called gangsterism, but the powerful forces in the neighborhood, the civic is part of that. So while I, in writing about these different moments, in writing about things, when that came up, if I link that to teaching, when that came up in the conversations around teaching, the civic was incredibly defensive. So Gertie, my partner, would say, no, we solved that. We solved that. Interestingly, we solved that in 1994. over not because of democracy, right, but because of hard civic activism. And over the period of this 10 years, so in this one very kind reviewer said, oh, this was a really patient book and the patience was good. I mean, I'd always been like, the patience was my own ineptitude and slowness. But in doing this partnership over 10 years, that political economy shifted. So a very powerful gang boss it was a very stable place when I came. Eventually the partnership ended because it wasn't the partners. The partners said, we can't bring you can't come into the neighborhood in this moment. Could I write about those sorts of things? No. So I do think that's really, really crucial. And where do you as a researcher draw this line? And when you're in partnership, about what you know and what you don't know, and what are your sources of knowledge. So I think that's a politics that we are engaging all the time. And certainly, that is something about what is foreclosed in a partnership. And when you're building it over and over again, when you're doing it repeatedly. Teaching, it was very interesting. I'm also writing in this, I didn't ever expect to be writing about teaching in this way, but I'm writing about equally totally problematic moments. And I'll just give you an illustration of one. We kicked off and I felt like I was in probably year 5 and we all knew what we were doing. We had our orientation, we'd get everybody on the bus, and it's this moment when there's a woman taking photographs and is like, oh, look at this, Shaq, gangster, and it's actually this deeply, and I describe it as like we're a zoo, trolling around this neighborhood, disturbing everybody and causing terrible questions of legitimacy for our partners. So what that actually elicited, everybody was outraged. The partners were outraged. I was pulling my hair, like, who are you? It turned out that the person taking photographs wasn't even in the class, had just come. So my own work of knowing who was on the bus and who wasn't was, maybe needed a little fine tuning. But that opened up a conversation in class. Actually, you came back to class the next day and the students were like, oh, that was the most objectifying, problematic. You can bring people to a neighborhood and they can learn nothing. They can just reinforce stereotypes. So then together we produced actually a protocol, a guideline, principles, and that's in this chapter. Like principles, we will always try and remember that our partners are residents and have a long-term life in this neighborhood. So we will do things like simple things like if we take a photo, you'll ask, obviously, but you'll also bring it back. So just layering and working on those. The students that came in, we're in a very privileged university, literally up on the mountain. And the students, it's also in this journal, it was a process of them and me and engaging with them on what were their perspectives. Some were from townships, very much like this. One guy was, he actually did he issued all the warrants of arrest. That was his side job, his way of funding his university. And he hated this project. He's like, we don't issue warrants in this neighborhood. And I'll tell you that there's 24 people who are up for this and 23 people who are up for that. And we're not allowed to go in this neighborhood because it's not safe. So why the hell are we going? Why are we doing this here? Equally, students saying, actually, this is totally familiar and this feels comfortable. Students, very privileged white students saying, why am I in here? Or I've never been in a place like this. One guy, he came back later to talk about it. He said, this is the world that I wanted to see and my parents had prevented me from engaging. So I think it's in this method of writing and engaging and talking, and the journal writing, however mundane and almost banal it is, it's actually really, really crucial of that engaging. The questions around violence is really difficult and really essential. And I think in thinking about these different publications, sometimes one project, and actually Antonadia, you came with me to the initial part all these years ago. In the second informal settlement, I showed a map. The leaders of that informal settlement shut down the project. They said, nope, this civic doesn't have the right to come into this neighborhood. And so basically in thinking about this, I'm being very long-winded, but in thinking about this is where my partner said, this project's stopping, go home. So she said, go home, I'll call you later. And it's actually a debate, and I had to speak to the counselor, and there was a really big debate. And it was an internal politics that was about our project, but our project became a vehicle for it. So I'm not going to go on and on. Sorry, I am going on and on, but I think it's these layers of taking these things that we know are tensions, and they're tensions in conventional modes of research and teaching, and opening them up, and over the duration of this sort of project, not trying not to get stuck in a binary while still taking these issues seriously. Okay, thank you for for laying that out.
No problem. Varnika, do you think you can allow Isha to speak? She has two questions. And so Isha Kunduri is an ex-colleague of ours, and she's Richa Nagar's PhD student. And because of her, actually, Richa was here a few months ago to present her work, and in a very engaged workshop mode. So some of us actually got your Richa Nagar references today because we had the privilege of interacting with her. There's a allowed to speak option in the participants thing. But I'll ask the first question, or the second one from Isha anyway, because it's actually a counter to the one I put to you. She's asking the reverse question. How do we grapple with engagement? What lessons lie for how we navigate the academy in the same tension, between academic prerogatives and, the way universities frame them? So do you have any tips for that one? And Isha is here, so she can ask the more substantive question. Isha, you can unmute yourself and speak.
Yeah, hi. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Sophie, for this very fascinating presentation. And I'm grappling with similar concerns of how do we do engage scholarship, especially in a very fragmented landscape that currently we are located ourselves in. So yes, one question is, what does it mean for the kind of demands the academy places on us? And especially wherein collaboration and engagement shouldn't just be another celebratory rhetoric, but a kind of a serious commitment that has to be sustained over time. So that's one question I had in relation to the question Mukta asked. But also I'm thinking about, you mentioned about a court case. So where was this collaboration in relation to the court case? Could this enable certain forms of legal struggles? Was it in tension with certain kinds of struggles? And you mentioned Coney Benson, and I was thinking about Coney's work on resisting occupation histories and the kind of intersections Coney talks about in the context of this relationship between certain kinds of oral narratives and certain kinds of histories that can be told via collaboration. And also you spoke about different kinds of we and constituted at different points of time. So again, thinking about what Richa calls the blended and fractured we, and what then are the implications of working through these factions for sustaining collaboration and its significance, because often fractures can be a point of rebuttal at which academics doing collaboration are told that this is not rigorous enough because this is so fractured, and so you are aligning yourself with a particular kind of group or ideology or so on. But my take on this, trying to think through these very difficult questions, is also that one has to engage with and work through that mess rather than say that the mess enough is grounds for not engaging. So a long-winded series of questions, but thank you. This is very fascinating, and I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you so much. And I feel like from what you've just said that we're in conversation already through Richa and Coney and others. Yeah, I think these are equally crucial questions. I mean, I had, and again, I'm trying to write about these as well, not to nail them down, but to just embrace them and really take them seriously. So for instance, I had a senior colleague who said to me, you are making a mountain out of a molehill in teaching in this way. Expect no extra credit and don't expect anybody to step in for you. And I actually appreciated the honesty of that, maybe not in that particular moment, but and I think so rather than being shut down by that, it's like actually this made my research, this gave me a space where my research, my teaching and living in this context really overlapped. That was totally, really essential to it. At the same time, University of Cape Town is a university which has a social responsiveness award. And in a South African context, there's a, both an embracing, it's very different than the context I'm in. Well, let me not worry about that. But I think that the institutional language of social responsiveness or community engagement, it's such an easy practice from universities to just assume that what they're doing is relevant, and it's really not the case. So I think that's also this project of writing, documenting, examining, and like you've already put very beautifully, really taking those refusals very seriously, but not as a stop. Actually, it's not. It's an impossible luxury to stop. It's not. That's not okay. Challenging it. Let me be completely concrete. Once I started, or very clear, like where it ended up in this case, once I stopped teaching this fell out of the curriculum completely. And I was naive. And when I do it again, I'm going to figure out a much more substantive way of how to anchor it institutionally in the curriculum. And I even had a colleague say to me, my colleagues, both on the one hand, some appreciated it, some liked it because it did a whole lot of things. One actually said to me, well, why aren't we doing this in middle class communities? Why aren't we doing this in rich bits of Cape Town? And it's like, go ahead and do this in rich bits of Cape Town if you want to. But so I think that there's a tension of like the university claiming it and using it, and the need to challenge that. But at the same time, for me in a South African context, to use that space. But I didn't do a good job of institutionalizing it. And I think, that would be something that I'm thinking about much more. The court case happened before. I went to court when I was doing this in a research mode. But all sorts of things that were outcomes of the court case. So basically the neighborhood group, the activists and the people who had occupied, they were taken to court by the city and named in this case. The city lost the case, they appealed it and they lost it. But then there was a huge amount of work of still getting the city to live up to the things that the judge said that they must do. For instance, deliver water, eventually deliver a housing project, which is still at this moment, the houses have just been built, and in the next like 3 or 4 months, people will move into them. So this work wasn't part of the court case, but the booklet that we did and that mapping of that settlement was really important in a more lateral way. So for instance, the legal NGO that had supported the court case, they really used the booklet to show the work, to show these stories of why this created security, even though this was still an informal settlement. So I think, in different moments, there's so many modes that are really crucial. I think maybe if I can end on, I really, I think Koni's work is, both an inspiration and part of this conversation. If I can just link in very simply, I'm insisting in this book, in the title, that this is a form of urban theorizing. In a way, that is also my response to this broader question, that this is not just about, a methodology. This is not about, this is about ethics and ethos, but this is actually also about a form of theorizing. And in the reviews of the book, like one reviewer was like, no, I really that's a really key contribution, that there are so many different ways of theorizing. And so in a way, that's the way in which I'm hoping that this will land back. And that's something that I'm going to keep on working on, is insisting on, in the spirit of others, in the spirit of Richard, but also Gotham Barnes' work, is, what are these vocabularies of Southern, what are these ways of centering urban practice, and insisting on both repurposing old words, finding new words, and really thinking about this as central work in the academy, central work of theorizing. Yeah, but thank you. Sorry for that. Another long-winded response.
No, it's yours. You're on stage. You can speak as long as you like. No, it's really interesting you say that, because some of us here, and I can see some of the colleagues from the campaign on Zoom as well, were involved in something called the Main Bhi Delhi campaign. For, it was a community campaign around Delhi's next master plan, and Gotham, of course, was, and there is actually a publication that IIHS wrote out of which is exactly what was the role of the university, but broadly of scholars like us in this. I mean, what did we do? What could we and could we not do? And were we really useful in the end? Because you're up against the state, which has its own processes. So we do, closely resonate with a lot of the questions that you're bringing up, and a lot of the insights. And I'm sure as we read the book, it will speak to us a lot more. Let's take some questions around the room. I'm sure everyone comes with their own experiences of field and their own experiences of how do we bring that field back, and how do we be reflexive about it. Anybody on the room who has some burning or not so burning questions of Sophie? What about on Zoom? Any comments? You don't have to ask questions. You can also just respond to the talk.
Silence is not good. So
Yeah, sure. Here you go. Silence is not good.
Silence is not good. Thank you, Sophie. I think I'm Pushpa Pathak, urban governance, planning, finance, management, all kinds of things. Person. These days, I'm with the CPR, and I'm doing some work on urban finance and also on small towns. But most of us who have done field-based research at some stage in one's life have gone through this dilemma of objectifying your subjects, the one on the basis of their experience in life, you gain knowledge and fame, and you get well known. And the question comes up time and again, what do you give them back? Does the community or the city or the society you have worked on gain anything? So in some ways, you took future groups of students to study. But did you bring any students from that community to your university? Is the question I would like to ask. I mean, did you teach anything else, like a language or basic skills of mathematics? Did your students also teach there? Did you bring the students from the community to the university? There was a possibility. In some cases, the cases we worked in, I don't think we can give back as much in the direct form, but we think that any policy intervention or programmatic intervention that could reach that community or city would make a difference. So we hope that. So our policy work is a little bit different than what you did because you had much more academic engagement.
Any more questions? Can you just take a minute?
Hi, my name is Siddharth, and I work as a researcher at the Accountability Initiative at the Center for Policy Research. And this was nothing short of inspiring. I mean, in this current context, trying to figure out how one wants to be part of the academia has been very challenging. I think your meaningful work makes it, it puts it back into perspective of what you can do while being a researcher, but also working very closely with the community. We have a lot of work that we do where we engage with bureaucrats at different levels, whether it's at the village level, whether it's at the state level, the middle tier, and elite bureaucrats as well. And we often have this question of how to share information back with them in a form that's useful to them. And they themselves also don't know what is most consumable, let's just say. So if you've got actionable insights, what form do you really put it back into for them? And you mentioned about, what is produced, what is fragile, what is trusted, where is it really being produced at? I know that the book might have answers into this, which I totally am going to read. But if you can share a little bit about how that process went about from the beginning, and where do you think it stabilized in terms of what the project itself was creating back for the community?
Oh, feeling tiny.
No, I think maybe Sophie can take
Yeah.
those two and then we
Great.
can get back.
Great. Oh, thank you, both of you. I think on this question, what's usefulness? Yeah, I completely agree. We have to be deeply skeptical. The place I started doing this teaching work was a project in University of Cape Town around service language, service learning, and that I found very, I was like, who's serving whom? I know that I learn a lot by doing this. I know my students learn a million things by doing this, but there's no concrete material challenge to any of this inequality. And so what I did methodologically is I went back. I didn't do it myself, but because I'm so involved. But twice we did a whole set of rigorous interviews where we opened up what was this experience for partners, and a whole range of things came out in those interviews that none of them tackle the material inequality at all. And actually writing about that is so crucial. This is not a romance, but things really surprised me. Confidence in speaking English. In a context where there's very little employment and none of my partners were steadily employed. What I thought was a super limited element of this project was we came every Wednesday and we arrived at this time, we left at this time, we're all in the syllabus on the schedule of the semester. That the regularity of that was actually something really appreciated. So something so tiny, a very moving, a woman sharing how her husband, when she told him she was going to be a partner, he just laughed at her and said, you can't write. Like, how can you be a partner? And again, very ephemeral, but her coming back and showing this booklet, I produced that, and her laughing at him. This moment of turning the tables. More importantly, another woman saying, I will now run. In South Africa, we have these school boards where you get elected and you're on the governing body of the school. And in a context where you had no parental participation, this is an important space and it's a statutory space. This woman running for that, saying, actually, from this practice of doing this, I'm actually able to do that. Other people, and this, again, it didn't actually happen in this way, but saying, I'm actually doing the work of the counselor. I am a researcher. Actually, somebody said this to you, Antonadia, when you were with me. I am a researcher. Actually, I've always been a researcher. Now I know what I'm doing is what we're doing here. And saying, I'm going to run for this, not that person, but two other people, and Gertie herself saying, I'm going to run for counselor. And in South Africa, counselor is a very well paid position. Okay, because of party politics, she didn't succeed in becoming the counselor. So the really crucial thing there is it's not a direct outcome of this, but a really interesting space. But at the same time, I didn't do a good job of sharing little extracts, but one just to give you a feel of this why narratives were so important in this writing. Just I had to get my water bottle one day at the end of a session, and I opened, and I shot this daughter shouted, "Oh, it's in the fridge, just get it." And I opened the fridge and there's nothing in the fridge. My water bottle wasn't there either. I opened the freezer. There's my water bottle sitting there with nothing in the freezer. So there's this this stark moment of this is very congenial, very positive, and then this is on the basis of the hard reality of inequality in the city. This question of, again, like, to point to the limits of this is so important. So in this coming back and forth and inviting the partners to the university, that was a really big move. And one woman, she said to me, I've lived with University of Cape Town my entire life, and I've never been there. And I lived with Cape Town because my dad was a cleaner, and I never expected to come to the university. Did, however, in, again, a structural limit, because, and this is really the challenge for thinking about this, the earlier question about how does this change what's happening in the university? No, nobody came, all these students came to the neighborhood. Did any students from the neighborhood end up in this university? Not in this period. And did I manage to do anything structural that helped that? No, right? So, but I think that is complete, that's such a crucial set of questions. In the planning department at UCT, they've worked on establishing in this sort of project, establishing a certificate, at least some form of acknowledging the expertise that I'm talking about. That I think is, I hope those sorts of initiatives can go forward, and that's totally a limit of this. Yeah. Sorry, I'm being so long in each of my responses, but what's fragile, what's stabilized? Such an interesting question. Things that we produce those posters for the parties. This is so, again, like not consequential in a policy process, but there were posters which like still exist and got laminated and lived behind the cupboard and then got pulled out. You know, so this question of I never imagined that those posters would last, right? They seem the most ephemeral of all of these things. Actually, they really mattered. This project on this minstrel movement is something that the neighborhood was super proud of. That was a city politics where groups running these, which are all from working class Black neighborhoods, they were claiming that this was development work, and the city was saying, no, this is actually a real relic of a racist system or something that's just for the neighborhood. Those booklets really worked because they really substantiated, this is developmental, like these are stories of youth getting involved. And so that different projects traveled in different ways. And I think that, like, again, turning that into a question, not romanticizing it. But I think that's where, in the ending this saying that we're all liaising in all sorts of different ways, I think for those, many of you working directly in a policy space, I think, there's all sorts of wonderful examples of co-production work where you can really try and take this up at scale. I mean, this is not a project at scale. This is a project that's, small partnership in a neighborhood. But I think that is the spirit. And I'm sure, yeah, you guys are all involved in those sorts of things. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, not always successfully. That's part of the frustration of doing this kind of work, that you do it in the spirit that something will come out of it, but unexpected things, and sometimes nothing comes out of it, and you have to be prepared that nothing is also an outcome. Varnika, can you get Saleha on? She was also part of the campaign, and she runs an organization that does a lot of very rooted practice work and has a very strong research ethos. So Saleha, you can unmute yourself and ask and sort of speak.
Yeah. Thank you, Mukta. Thank you, Sophie, for this really insightful conversation. And, this has also given me a chance to reflect upon our grassroots work here in New Delhi. We also work with, diverse neighborhoods, especially informal workers, women working in the informal industry. And my question to you is twofold. One, if you could, share a little bit about your generative documentation process, because I saw multiple iterations of, different maps, and then the maps had photographs. And, I really relate with that because we did a similar process with mapping, and how mapping initially was such an alien tool to them. And, through photo voice, through zine making processes, and through, just leading some of the community campaigns, we were able to make that process, easily readable and understandable. So one is about the documentation process, and the second is about, if you could probably touch upon, what is the afterlife of the project or the research, just because, there are limitations of resources, time, etc. So how have you disseminated this work within the neighborhood, but also how have you communicated the sustained continuity of your engagement efforts? That's my question to you.
Thank you so much. And I feel very lucky because Malvika Narayan is studying in where I am now. So she actually shared your work. And, really, she shaped this wonderful conversation in the year that we've been together there. Yeah, I think the mapping for me is is a lovely example. Just the things that you're talking about. That this notion of mapping. We know mapping is not simply neutral and objective, but at the same time, what goes onto the map, and then opening up and having these maps be both on the one hand quite messy, but actually very personal. Having that be more of an iterative sort of process. We had lots of really interesting conversations about, for instance, in that map that I showed you of this new informal settlement at year 1, families finding their place on the map in a context like in many cities where this settlement isn't on the map at all. Or the settlement is on the map around its illegality, around all sorts of tensions. So I found it's sort of obvious, but those maps aren't neutral, right? And again, in this narrative process of thinking about how did those maps travel and where. So the earlier one, which was the one that had gone to the court case where the settlement had won the right, even things like the streets were named and the square was named after activists in the neighborhood. And so connecting those stories of that practice and those histories to the map, there are all sorts of ways in which those things came together. This is a project I did ages ago, and I'm also not, I think if I was doing this now with a group of students now, we would have all sorts of ways. I was so impressed by both the scale at which your projects are working, and also the scale at which the mapping is working and its accessibility, all the sorts of technologies that you're talking about. So that's not part of this practice, but one way in which for me, and it goes back to this question of how does this land in the university, the afterlife of this project, there's a little bit of an afterlife in the neighborhood. So some things are still there. Many people are still doing research. There's a way in which that continued at a very small scale. But for me, this definitely changed. It didn't change the curriculum in our department, but in this MPhil 7 Urbanism, this new master's that African Center for Cities created, we really have this as a core pedagogy. And so in some ways, that's, in terms of thinking about how can we do more durable, more policy linked, not policy at the city scale, but really how can we produce research products in this collaborative way? And we experimented with different books. And I think those have a scale and a rigor, and it's partly that they're beyond just me. They were part of a broader African Center for Cities initiative. So I think that's an afterlife. And again, it's within the academy, but it's the confidence and the practice and the sort of models of how these can have a greater impact.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's for the people on Zoom who cannot hear even if you speak loudly. Hi, I'm a journalist here in Delhi. I wanted to know if during your research, did you have any kind of interface with the media? To take your thoughts, to take your work outside of the academic space, because I understand that this whole academic space, I mean, you're doing wonderful work, but it's just only a certain set of people who are reading it. It's not accessible to all. So did you reach out to your local media at any point of time?
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I'm like, no. For once, for the first time. In this project, I had and maybe I should have queered it, but a clear sense that there were things, we had a division of labor that my turf was the university, and the turf of those public debates was the civic. And that's quite a conservative way of thinking about it. But so, where they took forward, they took forward certain things. The Legal Resources Center, this NGO, they took forward certain things. But yeah, no, I didn't. But in writing this book, it's not answering the question of journalism, but in writing this book and in figuring out a way to make it open access, there's like, that the spirit of writing the book is, and in the spirit of thinking about urban theorizing that does have traction and that can travel and that isn't cloistered in a very narrow scholarly conversation, that's part of this. That's part of what in this need to find a change of form and a need to find, even on a very personal level, a way of writing it, and then in a more collective disciplinary level to think about how are we theorizing and with whom are we engaging and where does it reach. So I'm really looking, I'm going to have a book launch in the neighborhood, and partly as a way of remembering Gertie Square, my partner. And I think that's actually a space that I could rise to your challenge maybe a little bit, but also at the same time think about what are the stories that want to be remembered, to open that up as a question. So we're going to have that on December 17th, and I think that'll be really interesting. And in the space of somebody who was such a figurehead of activism and such a pillar of this neighborhood, how is that a space for taking conversations forward in a context where even before COVID, this partnership shut down because of all these tensions in the neighborhood that made it impossible and too much of a responsibility to carry it forward. And at the same time, like in a way, going back to your question, what could we do? There were limits to what we could do as urban studies students, and as the methodologies of mapping and of documenting. So yeah, I think it's a totally important question. Yeah.
It also links to the question on afterlife of your work.
Yeah. And in a way, yeah.
No, thank you. It's really important, but I guess the answer is that it was the community's call on whether they, wanted to publicize certain aspects of it, at least at the time that you were doing the project. Yeah. You have the mic in front of you, Partha.
Thanks. Thanks, Sophie. So I'm still sort of struggling to locate this space. Should you help me a little bit? In terms of one of the most amazing things, of course, is that long engagement. Look at the pictures, some of them from 2007, 2013. So one issue is to what extent do you see, what kind of change do you see over this engagement? Your students came and went, but you were sort of a constant feature. Both to some extent reflexively, in the sense that how perhaps your method of engaging might have evolved over this longer period of engagement, but also I think the settlement itself. Cape Town went through that, you had the water crisis, you had this, you had that. And especially among younger people, it sort of came in during this sort of period. Was there you mentioned this clockwork Wednesday arrival, and I'm just wondering whether that sort of opened up any new worlds for younger people in that space, just giving them a window into something else, but not necessarily that. I'm not looking at something, just from your sense of the kind of dynamism that's there in these settlements. The families change, a lot of movement back and forth, they move out, move back into where they came from. The second is about the sort of representativeness of this particular space. Is this fairly similar to the kind of my sense of Cape Town? So a lot of these stuff worked along these the train routes and structures and so forth, and how that sort of is this what kind of a settlement sort of it works through in that particular area, and how would you say that this would be representative informal settlement in Cape Town? And third, the issue, of course, of I'm curious about gender and as an interlocution. The little vignette that you offered about the engagement between the woman and her partner, to what extent were your interlocutors, I mean, what's the profile, gender, age, structures, uh, and in what way do you think it may or may not have affected the manner in which this particular structure was actually created? I mean, we have the same issue. We're out there doing interviews in a sense of it's often the woman who's responding at home because he or she is often at home. But I also see that in many cases in your space, you had a lot of these persons were not just, they're also home-based workers engaged in a variety of industries and the kind of structures. I'm just trying to get a sense of that livelihood and engagement.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, I mean, the neighborhood is an area of public housing, and it was segregated colored, and it was built in the 1980s. So in some ways it's very representative of that slice of Cape Town. It's a large proportion of Cape Town. The settlements that were built in it, this first land occupation and then this new occupation, that was really something very different for the neighborhood itself. Both a product of the no housing having been built and families, families staying and growing and being intergenerational, and the housing crisis, this commitment to staying in that area that led to families building the first settlement who were very tied to the neighborhood. And then the second settlement, in a way, because they won the court case in the first one, the second settlement attracting people from all over the place, and that being this issue. So in some ways it's very representative, and in other ways it was a space that really both challenged and worried and intrigued, who ended up in the settlement and where did people come from in the context of this, histories of colored areas being quite internal to themselves. So it's both representative and not. There are interesting stories of who joined the project of and when, and yes, all but two were women, and women of different ages, and who stayed the course of this decade. So Gertie and I were the stayed across the project, and that's interesting. That's also stories of how, so many women had been machinists in the textile industries in Cape Town and had been retrenched. Some were working in piecework, and depending on the season, depending on the moment, were in and out of projects. Many were, another division of labor. I said, that it was a community, or you gave a good short answer. It was the community's call on publicity. It was also the Gertie and the civics call on who participated. And so that really was often mothers and daughters and cousins, and very, very gendered. And then if we look at activism at that level of neighborhood activism in South African cities, it is very gendered. Does that help locate the space? I think the politics of the space is really also interesting. So it's an area that very dominantly supports the Democratic Alliance, a conservative liberal party, and in a politics around race and in a politics around race, class, and voting in Cape Town. In some ways, it's totally representative. In other ways, that's also an interesting layer. That question of becoming a councillor, what parties were on offer. This party that is in opposition and in control in Cape Town, that shut down, the sort of patronage politics of who became a councillor. There wasn't a pathway. There were pathways into other smaller parties. So there's an interesting way that helps, that situates the neighborhood as well. I'm not sure if that's the sort of thing that you'd be interested in.
Not too many people coming in from that structure coming into these neighborhoods. South African migration to me is a lot about depending on the kind of, there are some who are in the formal sector versus in pretty large household patterns. Households tends to grow depending on these income that person. That's the finding. Is also fairly, depending on how that structure, a certain degree of movement from villages into the cities, depending on what the sort of. But if this is a community of people who have been in Cape Town for a very long time, then those networks will be less.
Yeah, this isn't a cause of speaking community. This isn't. This is a neighborhood that is being built of removing of in the 80s of so-called black spots, basically informal settlements from around the city, and also a site where people removed from the center of the city, District 6, the last families in that removal out of the center of the city, this was one of the neighborhoods where they were sent. So that's actually an interesting set of dimensions. People's relationship to the center of the city. Also, what did it mean to get this housing? For some, it was the first formal housing. For others, it was an incredible downgrade and very demeaning. So that, yeah, but I think in this process of 30 years, the place the neighborhood came together was around tenant rights. This is all rental housing. And around not being evicted. And it's a very, I would say, a very both stable neighborhood, but a place where there's a very territorial politics, lots of concern about who's coming in. And some of that is a lot of that is quite racialized, but it's also, around housing struggles in the neighborhood. So, the first layer of work that we did was around backyards. So shacks built for expanding families, but then opening up those questions, who were in the backyards? Were they renters? Were they family? What was that set of relationships? And that's actually in that project, we did lots of mapping of toilet access of, on the one hand, here's a formal housing area. The city is prioritizing informal areas, but what is the need? The argument in that civic activism was we wanted to make an argument to the city that we have this need. But in general, this is a place where people stay and have been now for 40 years, and their relationships are rather to neighborhoods close by. And to a history of segregation built around this category of being colored, and then what happens then in this democratic period? What are the avenues and options both for work, for university, for education? Yeah.
Cape Town doesn't really have anything like the hotel. Engaging. Is there a unit within the government that sort of engages with these kinds of issues?
Not really. And African Center for Cities initially had an idea of doing something a little bit like the Gauteng City and Regional Observatory in a way that does work at the scale of the project that we were just chatting about. But we don't really, and that I think that's a big gap. That really sits, but in a way where I started, these broad brush need for engaging these massive dynamics around housing and big data questions around the city, and then this scale of micro level work. So we like African Center for Cities really works in that policy space, but I think both ends of that spectrum need lots of attention.
So we actually have Marie, who's a Maya from David's Johannesburg. She listened to your talk and she's just left a comment saying hi. So we had her on we do a monthly workshop series at CPR in collaboration with CSH, which is a French research institute here. It's a monthly workshop series we've been doing for 13 years or something. And during COVID, we actually had the opportunity, because it went online, to bring all kinds of people on board, and Marie was one of them, and there were also others from Africa. So this question of, sort of bringing the African experience and this very embedded experience to audiences in India is something that's been happening, and not just Africa, but Africa is good for the time zone, because going to Latin America becomes impossible for the speaker. So we have some limitations on the Zoom, but thank you, Marie, for coming and listening in.
Thank you, and apologies for my broad brush where I started.
All right, so any last words, or should I take the last word? Anyone else has any insights, any fun things or not so fun things to say? All right, so let's call it a day. And do you want to ask something? Go ahead. Just introduce yourself.
Good evening, ma'am. So, my name is Shivam, and I'm currently preparing for. My name is Shivam, and I'm currently preparing for Indian Civil Services. It was a wonderful experience to hear you, and many congratulations to you for your book. Uh, I didn't have a question, just a short comment. I really liked the whole of the talk which you gave, especially the last side, which was regarding, I think, urban theorizing or something like that, where you had mentioned a beautiful line which went like, it is a call to put at the heart of our university practice and scholarly work what matters to those with whom we make knowledge, those with whom we are inspired, and to whom we return. It was a really beautiful line. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shivam. I think I'll let you have the last word. So that was great. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, feel free to mingle after the talk.
Thank you. Pardon?